Okay, we're going.
Good.
So I'm Rob Paterson. It's my great pleasure to talk to Earl Mardle, who's in New Zealand. We met years ago in London, and Earl and I were sharing our views then of what might happen in the world. And Earl has gone and done a great deal to get ready for the kind of world that we've been thinking might happen. But I'll let him tell you all about that. So, Earl, you're not living the normal 9 to 5, life that people in the West do today. Why is that?
It goes back to about 2000 when I was in Sydney, living in Sydney, and I was down at the supermarket doing some shopping. And the little checkout belt that you put all your groceries on, and there's a divider that they give you to separate your order from the next person. And I noticed that somebody was advertising on the divider. And I sort of realized that we had reached the limit of the consumer society. If somebody had to go to all the trouble of organizing and selling advertising space on the dividers on your checkout belt at the supermarket, then we've sort of run out of places to advertise. And you only do that because you have to. Mm-hmm. It's like peak oil. The only reason that oil companies are drilling in the most appalling places or having to resort to fracking or whatever is because there's no other choices. Mm-hmm. And if those were the choices that businesses and advertising agencies were offering and having to make use of, then I sort of realized that we were within sight of that model of economic structure and process coming to some kind of end. And at that point, I had always been a cautious person. We had no debts at that stage, but I started to think a lot more seriously about, well, so if that's what I think, then what is the reality? Dot some I's and cross some T's, and then the next question is, what should we do about it? Yeah. And so I started looking for stuff on economics. That led me to some people at the oil drum. Yes. Who were talking about peak oil, and that was, although I'd vaguely heard of it, those guys were also dotting I's and crossing T's. And I started from there to branch out. There's people like Gail Tverberg, there's Nicole Foss and Elagi Meyer, there's Steve Keen, the Australian economist, and a whole bunch of other people who were vastly better qualified, had done the research, had applied, their qualifications to that information, and were coming up with answers that corresponded to my gut feeling. And so that led me to all of the stuff about climate change and environmental degradation and energy resources and the economics of all of that and the economic shenanigans that even then we were getting into. Yes. And that built up a picture that said, all right, you've paid off all your debts. You're a cautious person. So what are the next things to do? The logic, my wife, when she and I got together, had some financial investments. And so we talked about that and we got rid of those as it happened at the, on the upswing of a market. So we made some profits. That was all very nice. We moved into cash or near cash. And once we came to New Zealand, and we came to New Zealand in part because New Zealand is home, we thought to be closer to family and friends, especially family when things get harder. Yes. But also because I, perhaps in my slightly hyperbolical way, refer to Australia as a country that is going to be the Ethiopia or the Somalia of the South Pacific. It's very tribal. It's got very few resources. It's massively overpopulated, and is going to be one of the countries that suffers most under climate change.
And of course, it's got very limited water, hasn't it?
Oh, hugely limited. Drought and long-term drought is probably the default status of the Australian climate. And there's been a period of maybe a couple of 100 years when that hasn't quite been the case. But by the time Linda and I were ready to leave Australia, there'd been essentially 10 years worth of drought, with only tiny breaks in it. And then, of course, not long after we left, there were massive floods. Yeah. And so while, yes, the drought had broken, it wasn't broken in any way that was useful or valuable. It was broken in a highly destructive way.
If I could just make an observation, it suddenly occurred to me, Earl, that the Aboriginal culture was designed around 40,000 years of very limited water. It would have been something else if the long-term reality of Australia had been different. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, and to perhaps digress, and feel free to cut this out, but one of the things that occurred to me while we lived there was that somebody had pointed out that Australian Aboriginals spent less than 10% of their time foraging for food. And the rest of their time was spent playing with the kids, ceremonial activities, very complex and extended ceremonial activities and so forth. And that sort of one day struck me, and I had come across a piece about the feudal times and earlier in Europe, where somebody had counted up the number of holy days. And it was something like a third of the year. There was 100 and some holy days in the calendar. And those two pieces of information suddenly gelled. Yeah. And it occurred to me that societies that learn not to put too much of their resources into productivity necessarily limit their populations.
Yes.
So you could, in Australia, have gone out and spent your whole day foraging for food. And in a very short time, your tribe would have been able to produce, twice, 3 times, 5 times as many people. Yes. But in an equally short time, they would all have died of starvation.
Yes.
And the same sort of thing occurred to me about Europe. With a third of the year taken up with holy days, production was necessarily limited. And that limited population, and that's what made it sustainable. That's why very little changed for hundreds of years.
Yes.
And once we started with the agricultural revolution and started to find, quote unquote, better, more efficient, more effective ways of doing things, that's when we started to mine the landscape. And that's when we started to do so to the so-called benefit of population, and population went up, and then specialization and yada, yada, yada. And this is where we are now as a result of not having a system in place. Now, I don't for one moment think those people sat down and said, we have to limit our population. No. What I think is that those people, that communities that adopted those practices were the only ones who survived.
Yeah.
And especially in Australia, which is such a limit case.
Yes.
Those tribes that spent 20% or 30% of their time out hunting for food don't exist anymore. And the ones who limited their food production time are the ones who survive.
How interesting, Earl. This is, of course, the opposite of our cultural norm, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
So you and your wife came home to New Zealand with the feeling that we're in the final chapter of this type of civilization, the frenetic one that we're in now.
Yep.
Did you have any further clarity in your own thinking about, before we get into what you did, other than going home, which is no small thing either?
Yeah.
Do you have any other further clarity about what and when the end of this civilization would be like?
Not really. It's one of those things. You can. Hang on. Mother dog, enough. It's one of those things where you can say, we know what's going to happen. Yes. We can pretty much give you an order of what's going to happen. We can predict when something's going to happen. Choose one. You can't. The complexity that's involved in figuring out the pathway that we might get to, that we might get on, and where that might eventually lead, is far too complex, and I just don't have the time to waste trying to figure it out. So one of the things that we're trying to do is to build in as much flexibility as we can so that we can adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. One of the things that I think is really important that we do is, for want of a better term, to be in the present. because and this is something again that's been a kind of lifelong thing, is to have no expectations.
Yes.
Because expectations get in the way of figuring out what's happening. And it goes back to ideas like I was reading up on kendo, the Japanese martial art.
Yes, that's where they wear black suits and a mask and have a wooden sword, isn't it?
Yes, and the rule, one of the rules is that you must always be in a relaxed state, because if you are tense, then before you can move, you have to relax, and then you can move, and that slows you down. Mm-hmm. And to me, an expectation is a state of tension.
Yes,
that you are looking for something to happen. You are trying to make something happen, and so you fall into the confirmatory bias problem, where you're looking for a particular thing so that you can confirm what you think, instead of simply being present and aware of what's actually going on. I found myself, once we came back to New Zealand, we wanted to do some gardening, and so we did that. I knew nothing about it, and I'm still learning a hell of a lot. But what I found myself doing quite regularly, maybe a couple of times a week, I would come to and realize that I'd just been standing still in the garden, sort of not even thinking. And I came to call it listening to the garden.
Yes.
Trying just to be there, because every time you do something, doesn't matter what you do, every time you do something, you kind of change everything.
Yes.
And unless you're incredibly clever and incredibly experienced, you don't know what's going to happen by changing something.
No.
So we'd make a change, and then I would listen to the garden kind of thing, and not try and do too much until I saw how that affected, things like access, moving around, but also does it change the way the water moves, or does it change the shade, or whatever it might be.
Yes.
Before moving on, and trying to stay close to that state. I'm an active person. To some degree, I'm a bullet a gate person. Something needs to be done, so I'll go out and do it. Panic early and avoid the rush. But I've tried to also make sure that on a regular basis I just stop and just hang out in places around the property, and nothing will happen. I don't think about anything. I don't decide anything. But after 2 or 3 times, the thought will come, okay, we need to do this there. It doesn't mean we need to do it now even. No. It might be 6 months or a year before another thought comes which says, okay, now's the time to do that. Now you need to do it, because if you don't do it, it's going to be in the way of something else, getting done.
It's again so different from the prevailing culture. It reminds me of my favorite architect, Christopher Alexander, and he always suggests you just walk around the property for as long as it takes before the property tells you what you should be doing.
Yep. And there's no systematization of it, because it's so complicated. It's so complex.
Yes.
And that you can't. Well, I can't. I'm not smart enough to be able to try and write it all down. I've taken to doing a diary, partly because I'm doing a course on organic horticulture, and one of the requirements is that you keep a diary. Mm-hmm. But I still keep saying I don't need a diary, because the landscape is the diary.
Yes.
It's the other way around from the map is not the territory. In this case, it's the landscape, or the territory is the map. You walk outside, and because you are constantly involved in it, it tells you or shows you what needs to be done. God knows there's always more to be done than I can manage in a day anyway. So it's only a question of what's nearest and get started.
Right. So Earl, your sense is something. There's some ending, some events that are not going to be that nice are going to happen. Your first step was to move home to New Zealand for the reasons you've explained. You've explained your how you're basically listening to what is going on. You told me before we started recording that you've now moved to a property outside of Auckland on about 10 acres. Tell me what the kind of the doing is that you're not getting up and going to the office and driving into central Auckland and working at a bank or whatever, are you?
No, but
there is a period of time now that you're using to do something, you and your wife. To tell us a bit about what.
To be fair, Linda is still doing the traditional thing. She has a job at Auckland University. She has a pretty good income, and we are frankly spending all of it. So without her willingness to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning in the winter in the dark and go all the way, it's an hour into the city and then come back out again by train and get home in the dark. Without her willingness to do that, we wouldn't have the financial resources to do this in the first place. Mm-hmm. So that's an absolutely critical thing, that we have split our activities where both of us used to earn a cash income. Now she has the income and I get to spend it. And I put 100% of my time into this 10 acres. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, again, hypocritical though it may be, we make great use of woofers here, the willing workers on organic farms, who are mostly European, although we've had quite a few more Americans recently, who come to this side of the world, usually in a gap year, to do something different, to get as far away from home and the family and so forth as they can when they're sort of trying to stretch their wings a bit. And so they come and spend usually about 3 weeks with us. Mm-hmm. And they are also a critical resource because I would guess we are 5 years ahead on the process than we would have been if I had been trying to do this by myself. And it comes down to the simplest things, like being able to say to someone, here, hold that end of the piece of wood while I screw the other end of it to the frame. Mm. But it's more than that. We've had people who are builders. We've had people who come from families who run their own organic gardens, organic blueberries or whatever, who are able to give us advice. I've got a Swedish couple with us at the moment, and Eric is a qualified landscape engineer. So I'm saying to him, okay, mate, I want some of your knowledge. Mm. So all of that is contributing to the resources that we have to use, and we are extremely privileged that we're able to do that. But then, yes, part of the reason that we came out here was that we had a quarter acre in the city, and basically we'd covered it all in gardens and trees and so forth. And it meant that if I wanted to do anything more, anything new, I would have to stop doing something that I was already doing.
Yes.
And what that means as well is that that we realized that we were a long way from being anything like even resilient, let alone self-sufficient. And so I started to look for what were the options, and found that, we could buy a reasonable piece of land in the southern part of Auckland, or just on the southern boundary, for about what we could sell our little quarter acre in suburban Auckland.
Right. And
one of the things that we were looking at, or that I was looking at, was first of all fuel. We had started a coppicing experiment in the city, and we're starting to get some fuel off it, but it wasn't ever going to be enough to keep our fires burning for the winter. So I was interested in, okay, how do you extend that, and perhaps how do you go to a wood-fired oven, which also heats your water and warms the house.
Yes.
And that's still on the plan for as soon as we can get that done.
Yes.
Our 10 acres can certainly produce all the wood we need. That will never be a problem. But the other thing I started to think about was resources like cooking oils. Yeah. And you can grow all the food you like. If you don't have cooking oils, fats of some kind, then you are stonkered. Yes. You're stuffed for a lot of the diet that we consider, and so you would have to completely rebuild it. And so I started to think about, well, should we grow some olive trees, because we couldn't keep a cow. And then when we looked around for places, what we found was this place, which has 250 olive trees that are about 15 years old. Now, many of them are not going to survive. They were an experimental plot anyway. There's about 9 different varieties, and some of them are not suited. But they had been neglected for about 7 or 8 years. So we're in the business of renovating those and trying to get them back to prime condition so we can find out whether or not they're going to be sufficiently productive to keep.
Yes.
But that gives us firewood, another source of firewood, and it also gives us pickled olives, which are good to have, and it gives us access to the oil. And all of the hard work has been done because olives are very forgiving. You can beat them up really badly and they'll just come back like crazy. More importantly, they are mature trees and they have good root systems and they're well established.
Well, they'll outlive you, won't they?
Pardon? Oh, they'll outlive me. Yes.
Yeah.
So we have those already in place, and all we have to do is bring them back into a form and give them some support, a bit of lime and a bit of fertilizer, and they should be able to provide all the cooking oils we'll ever need and be able to use for doing other stuff. Like, once you've got a wood fire, then you've got wood ash. If you've got olive oil, then you've got an oil base that you can mix with the ash and cook up and make soap and all those kind of other things that you can do with these things. So that's an important resource that we have in place. But because this is 10 acres north facing, which is vital in the southern hemisphere,
right.
Then we had to look at water, and we have access to a stream that runs past the bottom of the property. We're allowed to pump water out of it for stock and for gardens, but that's a sort of government permission, and as droughts get more common, and we've had a summer drought, a winter drought, and a summer drought in the last 18 months. So everybody around here is now saying, well, we just assume there'll be another summer drought.
Right.
As droughts become more prevalent, longer, harder, then permission to use that water can be taken away.
Yes.
So what we are doing is building swales. We had a small swamp in the middle of the property at the bottom, which in our first drought dried up. So we have put in some dams. We now have 3 beautiful big ponds holding hundreds of thousands of litres of water, I would suspect. And now we're trying to shade them so that they don't dry out over summer, so that if we need to pump water from them for the gardens and so forth, it'll be available. We've cut one big swale, and once we figure out what the effect that has been on the landscape, we'll be looking to cut some more. We've planted the berm of that swale in fruit trees. We've put a second fruit tree orchard in. We've put probably 100 plus square meters of gardens to add to the 50 square meters that were already here, and now we're planning to expand that into more production of things like garbanzos and other beans. Add to that some corn, and then we have the ingredients for vegetarian protein.
Yes.
We keep cows. I've just sold off our last 2 cows to give our ground some time to recover in spring. But the long-term plan is to get some small animals, and I'm not even sure what the breed is. I've seen the animal I want. I just have to figure out where to get some. They're small cows that will milk, so they won't eat too fast, but they'll provide cow manure, which is absolutely critical to our compost making.
Right.
And this year I've made about 6.5 tons of compost. The aim is probably consistently to make about 8 tons, and that will be critical for the compost making, is that we get enough cow manure.
Right.
But then we'll be able to milk it. We're vegetarian, we're not vegan, so we like milk, we like cheese, and so we want to see if we can manage some of that for ourselves as well.
That's why the Jersey was such a popular cow, because it had very high quality milk, but didn't give that much, so you could actually have 1 or 2 of them for a family.
Well, in fact, a Jersey cow in New Zealand produces more milk than a family of 6 could possibly use. You'd have to swim in it, and that's actually a problem. And one of the reasons we won't be getting a Jersey is that they produce so much milk.
Oh, right.
And,
okay.
you can't have a single cow. You have to have,
You have to have at least two. Yes.
And then it has to have a calf. And so what I'm looking for is a smaller breed that'll produce, if we get 5 or 6 liters
yes.
of milk a week,
yeah.
that will be enough. That will be enough for our coffee, for our breakfast, and to make a bit of cheese. And we don't need any more than that.
It's fascinating. The whole of animal breeding has gone the other way, hasn't it? Holsteins now can just produce unimaginable quantities. But actually, if you're doing what you're doing, it's a bit like you want less.
Right, and not only do I want less milk, but I want I don't want the cow. You see, a milking cow that's in full production will shave your grass down to ground level.
Yeah.
And they'll eat anything, and they'll eat it down to the ground, and they'll do it very fast. I don't want that.
No.
I want to have the grass grazed, yes, but I also want it to be able to grow tall and go to seed.
Yes.
So we need to be able to rotate the animals slowly enough.
Yes.
In spring and summer that the grass goes to seed. Now, some paddocks I will let go to seed and have the seed drop and so forth. Other paddocks I'll put the animals in once it goes to seed because the value of the seed to their diet is huge.
Yes.
But I don't care if they leave some stuff in the paddock. In fact, I'm perfectly happy that they leave some stuff in the paddock.
Yes.
And then I'll go in with the mower after that, and I've got a scythe and I've learned how to use it. And, if I have to go in with the scythe, and first of all, we collect the manure and we use that for the compost and go on with the scythe and cut the hay, and then the grass can grow back again.
Earl, I have to ask you a question now. When you and I first met, we were talking about skills, and we both agreed that the kind of skills that you and I grew up with, these symbolic skills, weren't going to be a lot of use to us down the road. And you told me that we were also talking about investments, and you said, well, I'm going to invest in tools and I'm going to invest in myself to learn how to do things. And you said at the beginning of our talk here that you hadn't really gardened before. Tell our listeners a little bit about reskilling Earl.
The first thing we did was get a book on permaculture home gardening.
Yes.
And and I can't even remember now where I first intersected with permaculture. But that seemed to me like a good idea for a number of reasons. First of all, because the book talked a lot about enabling the landscape and the beasties in it to do as much of the work for you as possible.
Yes.
And that's now also why I'm doing an organic horticulture course, because there's a lot in that about enabling the landscape to do the work.
Yes.
And then we started. Okay, all right. Well, this is a basic instruction manual. So I started doing some of the things that it said, and after a while, and it didn't take actually that long before we started to see some results, and we started to eat our own food, and suddenly there was a shift from, okay, this seems like a good idea, to this is actually hugely satisfying. And then I sort of went crazy and started to convert the whole of our landscape, it was only a quarter acre, into a systematic process for producing food. So, the chickens occupied the worst piece of ground that we had that turned to soup in winter and went rock hard in summer. I buried it under wood chip and put the chickens on top. And once a year I took 29 wheelbarrows of compost, beautiful soil out of that the chickens had produced for me, along with the eggs.
Right.
And then other areas, became raised bed gardens because we had a south slope. We had Auckland clay, which is, bright yellow. And so you need to build up on it. You need to provide better drainage. And all the time going through and making the necessary mistakes and fouling things up, but also having ideas and trying them out. And some of them worked and some of them didn't, and, welcome to gardening. Right. But once we got to that to that point where we had our own greenhouse, we had our own chickens, we had covered the landscape, we terraced our entire front lawn, which was no longer lawn, and we had fruit trees and gardens and huge herb beds down the edges of the terraces, and suddenly the feeling of the place changed to be something really nice to be around all the time.
Yes.
And what I also learned from that was the patience of to accept unfinished work.
Yes.
Because I would start doing something, and I would get to a point where I couldn't do any more until I did something else.
Right.
So I would start doing that, and I'd get to a point where I couldn't do any more until I could do something else. And after about a year or 18 months, there were unfinished jobs all over the place, and I didn't seem to be making a hell of a lot of progress. And then one day I finished one of the jobs, which let me finish the next one, which let me finish the next one. And over the course of about 6 weeks, suddenly everything happened, and I finished all of those tasks.
So your system tipped.
Yes, exactly. From something that was non-functional to something that was a lot more integrated, a lot easier to work with.
Yes.
And suddenly my requirement for work dropped sharply, and that was one of the reasons for making the shift to this new place was I calculated that on average, and of course it will vary with season, but on average I was going to have to spend maybe 4 or 5 hours a week running the property. And that would include, preserving and harvesting and spraying and pruning and all that stuff. And then the question was, what the hell am I going to do now?
Right.
And so, let's take 1,000 square meters and turn it into 40,000 square meters. That could keep you busy for a while. And so we have, realizing that I'm getting older. At that stage, I was, 63, so I must have been just over 60. It was now or never.
Right.
Because it's a lot of work.
Yes.
And it's quite a lot of it is physically hard work.
Yes.
I spent a few minutes this morning carrying in 2 lots 50 kilos of line, 200 meters from the house down to the paddock, and then spreading it by hand.
Yes.
That's not trivial.
No.
And it's on a slope, so walking back up is also work. Right. It was either do it now or lose the opportunity forever.
Right.
Because by the time, let's say I was 65, I wouldn't want to be taking this on.
No. Earl, before we started recording, I asked you, how's it going in terms of progress, and many people think that becoming resilient is a goal in itself, and you can do it all by yourself. And you told me no, you're on a journey, and there are many other things that actually have to happen. You described this as building a bridge. So if we could just finish in the last 10 minutes or so, with you talking about, well, I'm here now, wherever here is, and this is what would be great if it could happen in the future to get my own family and other people around me in a better place.
Yeah, that is exceptionally difficult, because while I'm pretty clear about the kind of things that are going to happen, they're kind of meaningless as well.
Yes.
Because even just thinking about permaculture for a moment, there's a whole lot of rules and recommendations for things that you can and should do, but those rules and recommendations are kind of generic. They have to be applied in a specific place. My wife and I have this conversation every now and again where I say, okay, we bought all these fruit trees. Where am I going to put them? Or I've got some tagasasti, which is a tree lucerne. I picked the pods and took the seeds and sprouted them, and I've got about 70 of these tree lucerne plants that I need to put in the landscape. And I'll say to her, so where will I put them? And she said, well, all over the place. Well, actually, no, you can't put them all over the place. Every single one has to have a hole dug for it, and you have to put it in the ground. And so everything has to be thought of in terms of the context that you're living in right here now and what you want to do with it or what you think you want to do with it. And the same applies on that bigger scale.
Yes.
I know we are running out of affordable, available, cheap oil. But what are the implications for that? Who knows? My approach to that is I have a little tractor which runs on diesel. I leave it in the barn as much as possible, with the understanding that one day I may be leaving it in the barn forever.
Right.
And so what I'm trying to do as quickly as possible is to create a system, in Jim Kunstler's terms, that could be worked, as a world made by hand.
Right.
So thinking in terms of how do I do this if I don't have the tractor? What is doable here? How do we manage that? And the local effects of that will be very particular. For me to get from here to the nearest town by car takes 12 minutes.
Right.
But in between us is one of the steepest hills you've seen, on a public road. So you're not just going to replace driving in the car with walking.
No. Because
the hill will kill you.
Yeah.
And you're certainly not going to carry groceries back over it either.
No.
So it's that particular. But what we're trying to do here is to be able to have, in essence, a conversation with the neighborhood, because we know we can't do it all by ourselves. We know we're going to need the people around us,
right.
and yet none of those people are ready yet.
Because you're in a situation. This is the situation at the moment where there are just a tiny percentage of people who who not only think the way you're thinking, but are actually doing something for themselves.
Exactly.
And it's very difficult to bring people to think anything other than you might be a bit crazy, let alone
that's right.
To bring them.
And I've been a bit crazy all my life, so that doesn't sort of trouble me. But I've stopped having those conversations because they're a waste of my time, and I've got better things to do.
Yes.
So my neighbor Mike is a really nice guy. He's got some chickens, he's got a cow and some sheep and a bit of land. And we've talked several times because he drives past my back boundary every day on his way to and from work.
Yes. And
he's always saying, it's really interesting what you're doing. You've done this, and suddenly I can see that, and that's amazing. And what are you doing over there? And every time he says that, I say, look, I'll tell him what we're doing, but I'll say, come over and have a look. I'll give you a tour, and we'll talk about why we're doing it and all that kind of stuff. But I never raise that with him unless he's
yes.
mentioned it in the first place.
Yes.
And I never remind him that, the invitation is open, because there is just no point. He's not ready to step over the fence and talk about what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Yeah.
But the conversation that I'm having with him is that by doing this stuff, it looks interesting.
Yes.
We're making changes. We're doing things. We're busy all the time. And things are happening, and he is keeping an eye on it.
Yes.
And at some point in his life, he's going to need to know that.
Yes.
And at that point, he's going to knock on my door and say, "Can you show me how to do X?"
Right.
And at that point, we'll be on pretty much the same page. But I'm not a proselytizer. I'm not a joiner. I don't care to try and convert people. I think the denial that people are in on a whole lot of subjects is actually really, really fundamentally self-protective.
Yes.
That the moment you acknowledge these things, what you are opening yourself to is the understanding that a great deal of what is happening and what is coming to you is your fault.
Yes.
And nobody, me included, wants to be thought of as being to blame for the pile of shit that's about to land on us.
Yes.
And so getting to that point takes a huge amount of energy. And I'm extremely lucky I've been married 3 times. I've moved countries twice. I've moved cities God knows how many times in New Zealand. I've moved around a lot. So I'm completely used to letting go of something and moving on to something else.
Yeah.
And so for me to we spend a lot of time, effort, and energy and money on our previous house in Auckland, getting it just the way we wanted. And a year or so after we got it just the way we wanted, we walked away from it.
Yes.
And started afresh with a place that needed a hell of a lot of work.
Yes.
And to us, that was not a wrench. It was an opportunity.
Yes.
But most people don't function like that.
No, they don't.
It's incredibly stressful. They cannot just let go of all that work and go and do something else.
No.
And denial is the tool that you use to keep yourself from having to do it.
Yes.
And I'm not going to try and fight that. That's too deeply embedded in people's lives and their psyches, and it's too damaging and destructive to actually do it until you're really, really, really ready.
Earl, I think you've summed it all up very nicely. I'm going to switch the recording off now, but before I do that, thank you very much.
Absolutely my pleasure. Nice to talk to somebody who's happy to listen to me rave on.